This is National Educational Television, a program distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center.
History is one of the greatest teachers of psychology you can find. Books like the much read and often quoted How to Win Friends and Influence People, they're good, but history's better. History is full of examples of what to do, what not to do, examples of people who are good, people who are less good. Examples of saints and scoundrels, and of the great mass of us humans, most of us who haven't courage enough to be saints or heroes, and yet we hope that we don't fall into that second category. Now, in this present session, we're going to let history give us a very fine lesson in psychology. Perfectly true that very few of us are ever going to be called upon to run an empire. And that's what we're going to talk about, how not to run an empire. But, nevertheless, we all have to get along with our fellow human beings. And we can learn quite a bit from a quick review of these 12-odd years of colonial history. Now, in 1763, the time that the Peace of Paris was signed, England found herself the heir to a tremendously increased empire. She had won, at the expense of the French, she had won vast areas in North America. For example, she had taken over the French claims to Canada, and she had the French claims up as far as the Mississippi. The French outmaneuvered her and turned over their trans-Mississippi claims, so-called Louisiana, to Spain just before the peace treaty. But even so, with Canada and with the Trans-Allegheny West, England had a tremendous increase of her territory. And this wasn't all. While the war had been going on in the Americas, another war was being fought. England and France were the two main contenders over in India, and England had come out with the lion's share of the spoils there. Now, quite naturally, when Englishmen surveyed the fruits of the victory, they were delighted, they were elated. But yet, there was a sober side to it. England's leaders saw very quickly that this new empire that they had, while it was very grand, very vast, and all of that, that it was going to take an awful lot to run it. An awful lot in the way of manpower, an awful lot in the way of resources, an awful lot in the way of finances. Now, with this as a conviction, the Englishmen, the English leaders, saw that they were going to have to revamp their colonial policies. Now, up to this time, English colonial policy, to a very large extent, had been satisfied to regulate the lives of the colonials, the Englishmen overseas. There was regulation of navigation. There was regulation of their trade. There was regulation of colonial production. Now, all of these things, in general, fitted into what is known as the mercantilist idea of political economy. The colonies existed for the benefit of the mother country. And the mother country, home interests, whether they were manufacturing interests or mercantile interests or whatever they were, they took first place. Now, as I say, England had been satisfied with what income had been derived from this regulation, and the Englishmen, either the Crown or the favored groups in England, the merchants or the ship owners and the like, had benefited very greatly thereby. And then, in turn, the Crown could tax them. But you did not have direct taxes levied upon the colonials. Now, this situation very obviously was going to have to come to an end. English leaders decided, and decided rather quickly, that the whole of the empire, all her colonial subjects, whether in India or whether in the Americas, they were going to have to bear their proportionate share of the burden. Now, before we begin to see what the Englishmen decided to do in this business of revamping their policies, let's take a quick look at the colonial frame of mind in the year 1763, because here are the two elements in this friction that is to develop. The Englishmen, see, we've said, the Englishmen are convinced that something must be done. And they're pretty definitely convinced what must be done. Now, how do the colonials feel? What's their outlook? What's their attitude? Well, in general, England might not have been too satisfied had she looked closely, because in the colonial spirit, there had gradually grown up a certain measure of self-sufficiency. Call it independence, if you will. Not independence in the sense of a break of political ties, but independence in personal action. There had been, in the early days of the colonies, this period which is known as the age or the era of salutary neglect. When the Englishmen came over to found colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, found colonies in the Americas, the Crown at home was pretty badly distracted by its own problems and paid very little attention. The Americans, the early Americans, had to make their own decisions, had to meet and solve their own problems, and in that measure, they had developed a certain sense of sufficiency. You know, let's say that a little youngster is pretty much thrown on his own in his early days. He goes out and sells papers, or he works and the like. Now, it's going to be very difficult after he has grown up to a certain extent for someone to come in and try to change his life, try to boss him around. He's been on his own. Now, the colonies were in that same particular position. More than that, in the course of this 18th century, earlier in this 18th century, this attitude of self-sufficiency had grown to a certain extent into a certain spirit of willfulness. This had shown on a couple of occasions. It had shown very definitely during the late war, the French and Indian Wars. Many colonial merchants had continued to trade with the French islands down in the Caribbean, the French sugar islands, and Englishmen considered this as definitely treasonable. England had laid a certain number of levies for men, levies for supplies in order to fight the war. Some of the colonies had cooperated, some of them had given excuses, some of them hadn't even taken the trouble to give excuses. There was also, during the period of the war, there were two incidents, or sets of incidents, which rather definitely gave a hint as to how the colonies would likely react to a sterner imperial policy. England, unfortunately for herself, overlooked that. For example, during the war, there was the fight in New England, which was led by James Otis. The fight over the question of the writs of resistance, the writs of assistance. They could have been, it was resistance on the colonial side. Then, in Virginia, you had the famous case, which is often known as the Parsons Cause. And this brought to the fore one of the fiery Virginians, Patrick Henry. And both of these indicated, or should have indicated to Englishmen, that we're going to have to deal a little carefully with these colonies. Now, there was another thing, too, and this is quite important because it's at this point that the friction first develops. See, many of the colonies had had charter claims which gave them land beyond the Alleghenies. Now, they couldn't do much about it as long as the French held the area. But now that the French were removed, many of the colonials were thinking of moving out to the west, to these lands that they felt were theirs. And they had their hearts set on it. So here, in general and in brief, the Englishmen on the one side, the colonials on the other, unfortunately, there's not going to be a meeting of the minds. Now, very quickly, the English leaders begin to act. George Grenville, at this particular moment, is at the controls as the Prime Minister. Now, one of the first things that England does is to have the king issue what is known as the Proclamation of 1763. Now, this Proclamation of 1763 draws a line along the watershed of the Alleghenies and says to the colonials, you're to stay on the ocean side of that line until we give permission for you to migrate. Now, in general, the idea was good. And England, English leaders, intended the proclamation or the prohibition to move to the west against moving to the west, intended that to be a temporary matter until she could solve some of her problems. And she had rather terrific problems to solve in North America. For example, there was the problem of organization, administration, and defense of her newly won territories. There was the problem of how to divide up the land and make it available in equitable fashion. There was the problem of the Indians. And it was this problem in particular which the proclamation line tried, well, it itself could not solve it, but it set the stage for solving it. See, if the colonials were held back here along the seaboard, then the English leaders would have time to win the friendship of these Indians out here in the West who formerly had been allies of the French and had been schooled to hate and distrust the English. Now, that this was wise should have been perfectly evident to the colonials had they wanted to give England a break. Many of them didn't at this particular point. In 1763, you had the Pontiac Rebellion, in which Pontiac roused all of the Indians of this western area to try to form a united front against the advance of the white men. Here's our old friend Pontiac here. This is not the latest model. Let us just say that. Now, so the colonials are, or England, let us say, is off to a bad start. The colonials are mad. They say, why did we cooperate? Why did we try to drive the French out? Just so England could build a fence and tell us we couldn't cross the fence? This we don't appreciate. Now, in very quick succession, then, came three acts. The Sugar Act of '64, the Currency Act of '64, and then subsequently the Stamp Act. Now, the Sugar Act and the Currency Act, in general, had nothing that was very new about them. Both of them fitted into the mercantilist pattern. Let's make sure that the colonies serve the mother country. The Sugar Act prohibited trade with the French sugar islands. It was very largely developed in order to protect the British sugar growers against competition from the French sugar growers down in the West Indies. The Currency Act also sought to protect certain groups of Britishers. In the colonies, there was always a shortage of hard money, and a good deal of paper money had to be issued. And also, the colonials in general were rather constantly in debt to the British merchants for the manufactured goods which they needed. So, in order to pay off some of these debts, one or other of the colonies in the course of time, and in this particular instance Virginia, had passed a law making their own colonial currency legal tender for the payment of debts to the British. They had tried to give to be realists in the matter, and they had said, okay, we won't ask the British merchants to take the Virginia pound at par with sterling, but we will make a ratio. Now, on paper it looked all right. When the Virginians paid the British merchants, and the British merchants went out to try to exchange these Virginia pounds for pound sterling, they found that they had been very definitely shortchanged. They screamed, and Parliament passed this act. Now, most of these were pretty much routine. Not so the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act of 1765 is really the thing that touches off this pent-up colonial feeling. The Stamp Act is it's a venture into a new field, into a field of direct taxation. Revenue stamps are ordered to be carried on all legal documents, on advertisements, on almanacs, on calendars, on bills of lading, and so on. Now, this is an instance where the British are putting their hands directly into the colonials' pockets. And it's a type of taxation in which the colonials have not been consulted. Now, the colonials had no objection. They had paid, their legislatures levied taxes on them. Their colonial legislatures had done so. They had no objection to that because they said, we are being taxed by our representatives. Taxation without representation becomes the cry now. And they object very strenuously. There's a great show of opposition up and down the seaboard, and it more or less culminates in a very interesting meeting in New York in October of this year, '65. Massachusetts has invited the colonies to send delegates to a meeting here in New York, a fairly central location, and men from 9 of the colonies come up to discuss their problems. Now, out of this discussion grows the decision to put the pressure on the Englishmen where it hurts. They're going to put the pressure on English merchants. And they say, we will stop buying English goods. And they knew very well that sooner or later the English merchants would trot over to Parliament and say, for goodness sake, quit offending those colonials because our markets are closing in on us. And this is actually what happened. In the next year, there was a repeal of the Stamp Act. Now, the colonials, by cooperation, and this was a very important lesson, by cooperation had won a first victory. However, the British Parliament was no fool. And as a rider to the repeal to the Stamp Act, they passed the so-called Declaratory Act, in which they took the ground right out from under the constitutional objection against the imposition of taxes, even direct taxes. And they said that even though the colonials were not represented in the British Parliament, nevertheless, the British Parliament represents all Britishers, no matter where they are, throughout the empire. The colonials didn't pay too much attention to that in the exultation of having won a first victory. You might say they had more or less won the first round. Now, there was a short time out, and then in '67, you have the Townshend duties. Now, there's been another change of ministry. The Rockingham ministry has yielded place to a ministry headed by Sir William Pitt, Pitt the Elder. Pitt, however, is quite incapacitated this time, and the job of running the government falls on the shoulders of Charles Townshend, often referred to, particularly in colonial documents and even in enemy documents, that is to say, political enemy documents among the British, as Champagne Charlie. Well, there's pressure on him in England by the large landowners there to reduce the land tax, and he has to yield to that pressure. Now, that means a decline in the revenue, and he's going to have to make it up some way, and not having learned a lesson, he decides the best way to make that up is make the colonials pay. And he says, furthermore, they objected to internal taxation. All right, let's put a different type of taxation on. Let's put import duties. And so he passes, or he proposes to Parliament, and Parliament passes a series of duties on all glass, all lead, paper, and tea introduced into the colonies. Now, once again, the colonies flare up. They say, we, perfectly true, but we were not consulted in this. We don't mind paying taxes as long as we have our say, as long as we are given the rights of Englishmen to tax ourselves. Now, in the next few years, there are a number of incidents which show the temper of the colonials. Now, for example, Townsend, in order to see that these duties were collected, he went back and dug up this old problem of the writs of assistance and said they're legal. All right, the colonials had objected very strenuously 10 years before, 13, 14 years before, to these these unspecified search warrants. Then you also had the question of the violators were not going to be tried in jury courts, they were going to be tried in admiralty courts. And the colonials said, all right, he is getting himself into a position where he can do just about whatever he wants. We are losing our say. Now, once again, non-importation agreements begin to show, and the like. And here you are with the colonials just jumping up and down. And in 70, there's another change of ministry. Lord North comes in, and he decides to shift the to shift the pattern. Now, everything goes well until 1773. And the colonials begin to build up a good deal of confidence in King George III. They figure, okay, the fly in the ointment, the real bully is Parliament, not the King. There's a fair amount of loyalty to the King. Then North allows himself to be maneuvered into the Tea Act. Now, this Tea Act of 1773 really starts things going. And the story behind it, briefly, is this. During the previous acts, the Townsend Acts, a number of the colonial merchants had smuggled a good deal of Dutch tea into the colonies, and they were selling this Dutch tea. The British East India Company was in a rather bad state at the time. Its finances were tottering. It was on the verge of bankruptcy, and here in its warehouses, it had some 17 million pounds of tea. If you want to call it frozen assets, or call it iced tea, if you will. Now, don't throw anything, because remember, you'll hit the picture tube and you won't hit me. At any rate, so Lord North says, good, colonials, let them bail out the BEI, the British East India Company. So he puts a tea duty, and he's going to give the British East India Company quite a bit of leeway. He says, we will not make them go through England. So therefore, no English merchants will have a cut. And they can carry their tea directly to the colonies, and they can either sell it themselves or sell it through colonial merchants and undersell the ordinary English tea and undersell the Dutch tea. They figured that the colonials would rise and buy this tea, the British East India Company would be bailed out, and the like. Now, what this did to the colonies, what this seemed to indicate to the colonies was England is now maneuvering to put colonial merchants out of business. She's going to give preferential treatment to an English company. And if she does it to tea, she may do it the next time to some other commodity, and we will be out of business. So they rose up. And the sequel was a number of incidents along the seaboard. The most important was the Boston Tea Party, at which time a number of the Bostonians boarded the tea ship and dumped thousands of pounds of tea into the harbor. Now, England came back. This was an overt act of disobedience. England came back with the intolerable acts, by which she decided to punish Boston, punish Massachusetts. The port of Boston was closed, and Boston, the Massachusetts Assembly was deprived of a certain number of its powers, and so on and so forth. Now, this was serious. And a few years before, Sam Adams had set up a series of, sort of a colonial grapevine, known as the Committees of Correspondence, and buzz, 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 all along the seaboard, what had happened to Boston was relayed, and the colonials felt, all right, England is trying to get tough now. We have to do something to protect our rights. Parliament is running roughshod over us. And if we just lie down, well, we're goners. So they issued the call for the First Continental Congress. And the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1774. And it was to decide, they were to determine just how much authority has England over her colonies, and what are we going to do about these intolerable acts. Well, the answer to the second was to establish what was going to be a progressive boycott. They were going to try to hurt the English merchants. And then they left and said, we've gotten so much done here, let's meet next year in May. Now, as you know, by May of next year, this Cold War that was going on had warmed up considerably, because in April of 1775, you had had the clash at Lexington, and you had had the clash at Concord. The Minutemen had stood out against the British Redcoats and had given a show of, the colonial temper. Then the colonies, the colonials, had surrounded the British at Boston. Now, by the time, therefore, that the Second Continental Congress meets, as I say, the Cold War is getting quite warm. And that's where we'll take up the story next time. Now, let's just offer one or two suggestions by way of books if you're interested in following through. Here we have, in this favorite Colonial Chronicles of America series, The Eve of the Revolution by Carl Becker. Another story of the preliminaries to the Revolution, The Origins of the American Revolution, John C. Miller, I-L-L-E-R. One of the old classics by a great scholar on the Revolution, now dead, Claude Van Tyne, T-Y-N-E, The Causes of the War of Independence. And the latest thing out on this particular phase is this volume in the growing Harper series, the New American Nation series, The Coming of the Revolution by Lawrence Henry Gibson. Now, the whole story adds up, as we have seen, to a certain amount of bungling. England might have avoided many of the things which subsequently came had she been a little bit smarter. So let's close it off with the thought, this is how not to win friends and influence people, how not to run an empire. That's it.
The preceding program was distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center. This is National Educational Television.